Our world can be a desolate and draining place. It can steal our hope and leave us running on empty. But then there are those people who live in the same world, yet they're hopeful. They have what seems to be an unshakable confidence in God, in spite of what they've seen, in spite of what they've experienced, in spite of what's happening around them. They don't have amazing beliefs, they have amazing faith. So where does that come from? And how do we get it? How do we rediscover and refuel our faith in a world that's running on empty?
Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see you this morning. My name is Josh. I am a pastor here at Terra Nova, which still feels awesome to say. So excited to be here. I'm so grateful for this church and for all of you. And excited to jump into our week 3 of our series, Faithful. The big idea here in this series is simply that faith matters. As a matter of fact, I was thinking this week for centuries, millennia even, philosophers and really everybody who's alive has been asking the question, what does it mean to live the good life? Like, how do I live well? What's the meaning of life? Why am I here? And we answer that question in all sorts of different ways. Generally, all the old favorites, all the old cliches of money and power and fame and whatever else. But the Bible answers it in a really distinct way. It says the answer to the good life, the key to the good life is faith. That if you live a life of faith, your life will be qualitatively better than if you don't. That's what God wants from us. That's what we've talked about a couple times. Impresses Jesus. Jesus was amazed twice in the stories of Jesus. Both were in relation to people's faith. So we figure if that's what God cares about, if that's what it means to live the good life, we should probably spend some time talking about what faith is and what it looks like in action. So we've been working through a definition of faith that comes out of the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that says simply this: that faith is the confidence about what we hope for and assurance about what we don't yet see. Confidence about what we hope for, assurance about what we don't yet see. Now, this is a definition that's maybe different than how most of the world thinks about faith, because those words like confidence and assurance, or like we talked about last week, substance and evidence, are not usually how you think about faith. Usually faith is this kind of this belief thing that sits in the back of your mind, and it's kind of vague and uncertain, but that's not at all how the writer of Hebrews or the rest of the Bible thinks about faith. Instead, the Bible teaches us that faith is not blind belief, but it's certainty based on a rooted in experience. Okay, certainty rooted in experience. And to kind of unpack that definition, because we all love story, it's one thing to have sort of an abstract definition, but if we can see this in action in stories, then we can really learn from these stories. So to unpack that definition, we've been going through the rest of Hebrews chapter 11, kind of highlighting a couple of key moments, these stories of faith. Hebrews 11 is often referred to as the Hall of Faith, kind of like if you're a sports fan, the Hall of Fame, where you send all the people who are the best athletes or the best at their sport. The Bible has one of those too. It's here in Hebrews 11, and it tells some of the stories of the most remarkable people in the Bible, people of remarkable faith. And here's kind of the story of the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. And if you read Hebrews 11, you'll see that, so I got to get to my spot. I didn't put my bookmark where it belongs here. Rookie mistake. We'll make sure it's, like I always say to the first service, I'll make sure it's corrected by the next service, which means nothing to you all. But anyway, if you look at Hebrews chapter 11 in the Hall of Faith, it starts out in the very beginning, with sort of creation and some of the characters here. Then if you were with us last week, we camped out in this dark blue section with a guy named Abraham, which for me, preparing that sermon was really encouraging because I found out that Abraham, this great hero of faith, wasn't all that different than me. That he had doubts, he had significant failures, and at the end of the day, the thing he did best was he received grace. That was so encouraging for me to realize that the Bible doesn't give us the story of Abraham to say, look at what you can never be like. But instead, here's a guy just like you. And if you just put your faith in God and go when he says go, even if you do it imperfectly, that's what I'm asking of you. I was so encouraged by that. But the story then continues. And from Abraham, you can see kind of the Old Testament timeline here. We're not going to work through the whole thing, but it tells us some of the stories of the Exodus and this guy named Moses. And And from there, it moves into the promised land. The people of God move out of there's a whole bunch of history that I'm skipping over here, as you can tell. Some of you know it. If you don't, that's okay. Well, that's a conversation for another day. But we move into this time where they finally will eventually, in the sort of light purple here, or maybe lilac, will settle into the promised land. And in the promised land, not everything doesn't go exactly as planned. It wasn't all daisies and roses, but they end up having a significant split in the kingdom. You see where the timeline kind of divides into two places. And eventually, both of those kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, will kind of run afoul of a great global empire. The northern kingdom will run into the Assyrian Empire, will end up being kind of destroyed, here where that timeline comes to an end. And the southern kingdom will bump into a group of people named the Babylonians. And that's where our story is going to take place today. Let me read kind of this section. Everything from the purple up into to the red here is summarized toward the end of Hebrews chapter 11, really quickly and succinctly. It starts in verse 32. So after we've told the story of the whole Torah, here's where the writer of Hebrews lands. And what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouth of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released that they may gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute and persecuted and ill-treated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. It's amazing, kind of rapid-fire retelling of the Old Testament story. These characters coming out of stories that we may have heard before, and they're so good, and I wish we had time to dive into all of them. But like the writer of Hebrews, we don't. I love how they say that. I don't have time to talk about all this stuff. So let me give you the quick overview, is what the writer tells us here. Today, we're just going to camp out on one of those stories, one little phrase in there that you may be familiar with. It says, who quenched the fury of the flames. You may recognize that as the story of three guys we know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And it comes out of Daniel chapter 3. I love this story. This is so good. Before we dive into Daniel 3, though, which I did bookmark, yes, I want to give you a little context on a couple of terms. So if I put that timeline back up on the screen here, we are in this section down here that's titled Babylon. If you see this in the darker purple there, this is during a time known as the Babylonian exile, when the empire of Babylon had taken many of God's people out of Jerusalem and taken them back to Babylon. So before I get into the story, I want to define two terms that I just used here, okay? The first one is empire. Now, empire, the official Merriam-Webster definition, is a major political state that unites a diverse mix of territories, nations, and peoples under a single supreme authority. And that sounds kind of nice, this diverse mix of territories and nations. What this definition doesn't tell us, though, is how you achieve a diverse mix of people, nations, and territories. It's through conquest, okay? So it basically works something like this. You have a nation, a kingdom that is somewhat prosperous, that accumulates some excess wealth. And rather than using their excess to bless the nations around them, they think, what if we invested this into military? Then what we could do is we could take the nation next to us and annex it. We could make it a part of our kingdom. And so they do this, and they expand a little bit over here, and then grow more prosperous, and begin to look at another nation. And pretty soon this kingdom begins to spread out, accumulating territories and nations and peoples under a single supreme authority who would be known as the emperor. This is how empire works. In other words, always expanding outward. Okay? There's an American industrialist, the world's first billionaire, was a guy named John Rockefeller. Today, his net worth would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $600 billion. So very, very wealthy man. The world's very first billionaire, the first guy to have over $1 billion. And once he summarized the mantra or the slogan of empire like this. He was asked, how much money is enough? And what did he say? Just a little bit more. That's how empire works, okay? Empire is ever consuming, but never satisfied. Ever prospering, but never grateful. That's how empire works, just a little bit more. Now, empire has a little bit of a problem, though, and that's how do we maintain our empire as it expands outward? Because the bigger it gets, the more difficult it is to manage, and that's where our second term comes into play. The term is exile. Here's how it works. You have two options, essentially, for managing or maintaining your empire. The first one is what we call occupation. Okay, remember how they achieved the empire in the first place. They did it through conquest, which meant that their problem was they had to manage an empire full of people who hated them. Okay, this is people whose fathers and sons you've killed in battle, who you've taxed relentlessly. So how do we keep control of this ever-growing empire that's farther and farther away from the center of power? The first option is you send a bunch of troops all over the world. The problem is that's expensive and a real pain because you just spend all your time putting out revolt after revolt after revolt. The second option was what we call exile, which involved relocating people from their homes to the capital city. Here's how this works. You go in, you conquer a city or a territory. You take the best and the brightest, the most powerful, influential, educated, wealthiest people, you pull them out of that territory, and you send them back to your capital city. Now, what you've done is you have decimated the leadership structure of that local area. So all the most influential people are gone. It's going to be a lot more difficult to mount any sort of revolt against the empire. Then, sometimes, you take some of your own people from your capital and you transplant them over here, so you are planting people loyal to your empire over in that part of the world. Now here, though, is the real secret sauce of exile, okay? You take this group of people, this educated group, you move them to your capital city, which was very disorienting for them, okay? Involved a change of scenery, it involved culture shock, it involved all sorts of new experiences, new sights, new sounds, new smells, new gods, new people, new everything, new food. If you've ever traveled, you know how disorienting it is to be in a new place. You move them, you rename them, okay, so you give them a new name. In the ancient world, name and identity were tied together. Names weren't just random sounds that we liked. You gave somebody a name that meant something, that defined their character in a way. So when you change somebody's name, you're trying to change their identity. You rename them, and then here's the key. You treat them really well. You spoil them. Okay? A lot of people, when they hear about exile, think that they were thrown in prison or beaten or mistreated. That's not the case. Remember, these were wealthy, influential people. They were good leaders, so you treated them as such. You moved them into nice houses. You fed them well. You gave them high-paying jobs. And here's the reason. It's because the whole strategy of empire is forgetfulness. The ultimate goal of exile is forgetfulness and thereby assimilation. Okay? You treat them well so they will forget where they came from. This is the rationale. They come into a new place, and if you beat them and treat them poorly, they will ever resist you. But if you treat them well, you give them high-paying jobs, they have even more wealth, more prosperity than they had back home. Eventually, they will forget where they came from, forget who they are, and they will be yours. And then within a generation or two, they'll become completely Babylonian with no desire to return back home. The first and second generation will no longer even know their history or their story. They won't speak their language, and then it's over. It's game over. They can move wherever they want in the world. It doesn't matter because now they are citizens of your empire. See how that works? And it actually did work. Okay, the people of God were in exile in Babylon for about 70 years. After 70 years, they were allowed to return back home, and very few of them actually did. Some scholars estimate that less than 10% of the exiles returned back home. What happened to the other 90%? They became Babylonian. So, here's these three guys. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but their real names, their God-given names, were Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We learn these names in Daniel chapter 1. They were Jewish young men of wealth and influence and education who were among the first exiles taken from Jerusalem to Babylon. When they were taken, they were given new digs, they were given good food, they were given high-paying jobs, and they were given new names. The name Hananiah, I love that name. It means Yahweh is gracious. The name Mishael means who is like God. The name Azariah means Yahweh is my help. Beautiful names, aren't they? All in relation to the character of the one true God. When they're taken to Babylon, they are renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach means something like servant of the sun god. Meshach means who is like Aku, which is another Babylonian god. Abednego means servant of Nebo or Nego, another Babylonian god. You see what's been done here? We've changed their names, which were about their relationship to Yahweh, who he is. And now they have names that are about their relationship to the empire. Move them, treat them well, rename them, and then this happens. Daniel chapter 3, verse 1. This story is so good, you guys. Oh my goodness. Okay, King Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, which explains a lot. Now you know 6 cubits wide. I don't know what a cubit is, but anyway, and it's a big, tall thing, about 90 feet tall, they say, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And then he summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Whoever doesn't fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Now you might be thinking, wait. You just told me they treated him well, and here he is threatening to throw them into a furnace if they don't bow down to the statue that he's made. What's the deal here? And the answer is, this is Nebuchadnezzar's end game, okay? Why the statue? Why the statue? Here's the deal. Nebuchadnezzar's a smart guy, and he knows that you can take somebody from their home and you can give them a new apartment in the city with views of Babylon and all the gardens. You can feed them well. You can dress them like Babylonians. You can teach them the Babylonian language and culture. You can integrate them in, and at the end of the day, they can still be Jews living in Babylon. But the second you get them to bow down to the gods of Babylon, you have won. It's game over. Why? Because he knows that as human beings, we are what we worship. We are what we worship. Fundamental to our identities is what we will bow a knee to, what we will spend our time and our money, our talents, and our treasures on. We are what we worship. There's this theologian I love named A.W. Tozer who says it like this: what comes to our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Think about that for just a second. The single most important thing about you, and I think Tozer's right here, is what you think about God. Why? Because that sits at the very base foundation of your life. Whatever you think about God, even if you think there is no God, will fundamentally dictate the way you live the rest of your life. So if you can get somebody to stop worshiping Yahweh, or even just to begin worshiping another God alongside Yahweh, you have won. You have taken their identity. Nebuchadnezzar knew if he had their worship, he had their identity. So this was his end game. Treat them well, soften them up, and then hit him with the statue. And here's how it works. If they bow down, he's got them. They're his. They're Babylonian for life. If they don't, they never will be. If they refuse to bow, they'll never be Babylonian. It doesn't matter how much use I get out of them. Throw them in the fire and be done with them and move on. That's the rationale here. Now, why do I spend all this time talking about exile and empire and how it works? And the answer is because this is always the situation that God's people find themselves in this world. Always. From the beginning of the Bible onward, God's people were surrounded by empires. God's people are always called to live as kingdom people in a world of empires. God's people found themselves subject to the Egyptian Empire. The northern kingdom was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom, as we're talking about here, exiled by the Babylonians. Then come the Persians, then come the Greeks, eventually the Romans in the New Testament. But it's not just this notion of like political empires, it's also spiritual empires that exist in the world today. I mean, the Apostle Peter, who was one of Jesus' friends that walked around with him, wrote in the book of Peter to the exiles living among the nations. That's what he called the church. He called them exiles. What's so interesting about that is many of the people he was writing to were living in their hometowns where they had grown up. The case is made by the New Testament and by Paul even in the book of Philippians, which, spoiler alert, we will be talking about in a couple of weeks, that our citizenship as followers of Jesus is no longer here on earth, but is somewhere else entirely. And therefore, we are exiles on earth, even when we're living in the town we were born in. Because here's how it works. You have an encounter with Jesus, right? Maybe it's in a church, maybe it's in a conversation with a friend, and you decide in that moment that you want to surrender your kingdom for his. You bow a knee to King Jesus and you give him your allegiance, and everything has changed. In that moment, your citizenship has changed. You are a new person. And then he does not just suck you up to heaven. Doesn't just take you straight home. Instead, he sends you back to the old place. You go back to the exact same home. You go back to the same family. You go back to the same work. You go back even to some of the same temptations. To an old place as a new person. You are now an exile because your citizenship is somewhere else and you're not there yet. You're still here. You are a kingdom person living in a world of empire. And the goal, the challenge then of the Christian life is how do we maintain and grow our faith in a toxic environment? That's really the reality of it. And I don't mean toxic like, oh, it's so evil out there and dark, although it can be sometimes, but it's just not the kingdom of God. And nothing out there is naturally set up to fortify your faith. Nothing out there is set up to help your faith grow. You have to work at it. In fact, you're going to experience a lot of the stuff that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. You're going to experience people trying to rename you. God has given you a name and an identity. He speaks over you. And then you go out into the world and people try to rip that name away from you, and culture tries to rip that name away from you, and you have to fight to remember it. You have to fight to worship one God in a world full of idols. You have to fight to bow to one king and one king alone in a world full of pretenders assuming the throne. You are a kingdom person in a world of empire. This is your story. So the question is, how did they do it? What was it about their faith that allowed them to maintain faithfulness, to grow in a world of empire? And the answer is real simple. Nebuchadnezzar said, bow, and they didn't. Their faith was defiant. Defiant. They defied the word of the most powerful man in the world. They defied the spirit of empire. They refused to bow. Now, I want to be really, really careful here. I said that their faith was defiant, that these were not defiant people. They were not oppositional. They were not out to overthrow Babylon. They were not disruptors. They weren't making noise and chaos all the time. I feel like I need to say this because sometimes in this world, Christians are known more for what they're against than for what they're for. And this is not what God wants for us. As a matter of fact, there was a letter also in the Bible written to the people living in Babylon by a prophet named Jeremiah. He wrote on behalf of God. And in Jeremiah chapter 29, writing a letter to exiles like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he says, settle down and work for the peace of the city. Work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I have sent you. Craziest thing for God to say. You've been exiled to Babylon. They are your enemies. Now work to help them prosper. That's what God says. And that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They plugged into the city. They built relationships. They worked hard. The story will tell us that the king really liked these guys. They were not known as disruptors. They were not known for what they were against. Okay? Their default posture was not resistance. Their default posture wasn't resistance, it was faithfulness. Okay? They were not oriented against anything, they were oriented toward someone. See, this is a key distinction. They weren't out to defy all the time. They weren't out to cause problems or disruption all the time. They were oriented in faithfulness to God. And most of the time, that faithfulness to God looked like blessing the city, working as hard as you could, being a good exile in Babylon. But when the king asks you to bow to another god, you stand and with all due respect say, we will not. We choose him over you. And that's what happens next. If you can continue on in the story, you'll find that really what they did is they chose this life of faithfulness to God above anything else. They chose to be oriented toward him. And that idea of faithfulness, I think, is a really important facet of this whole conversation about faith. Faith and faithfulness are obviously related to the same word, but we don't often think of them in the same setting. Like I said, we often think of faith as something that's sort of vague abstraction in the back of our minds, and faithfulness is like a choice, it's loyalty. And that's really what it means in the Bible. And it's rooted in the character of God. There's this great word in the Old Testament that describes the character, the defining attribute of God's character, and the word is chesed, which I love so much. Chesed, because you got to make that sound in your throat. And oftentimes, this word appears throughout the Old Testament all over the place. Oftentimes, we translate it as mercy, or sometimes as steadfast love. But what it really means at the root is covenant loyalty. Chesed means covenant loyalty. So when the Bible says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, his love or his mercy endures forever, that word is chesed. In other words, they're saying, give thanks to God, for he is good. He is loyal to us all the time. He is faithful. He is trustworthy to his people, to his word, to who he is. And we see that same notion in the New Testament. Paul will very famously talk 3 times in Galatians, Romans, and Philippians about the faith of Christ. Now, oftentimes in our translations, it'll say faith in Christ. But really what it says in Greek in those 3 passages is the faith of Christ. In other words, Jesus was faithful. That's what Paul is saying. God told him to do something, and he could have chosen another route. But he chose to be faithful to the Word of God, and his faithfulness becomes the foundation of our salvation. That's true, isn't it? Jesus' faithfulness is why we're all here today. Now, because that's his defining attribute, it's covenant loyalty, it's faithfulness to his people. Now, in response, we offer back faithfulness to him, allegiance to him. That's what faith actually means. He has been faithful to us. We will be faithful to him. He loves us. Therefore, we can love him. That's how it works, and that's what these guys do. Hey, King, you know we've worked hard for you. We've worked hard to bless this city. We will continue to do so if we're allowed to do so, but we will not bow because we're faithful to our King and to our God. This is how the story actually goes. This is what they literally said. This verse 13 here. We're going to skip down a bit. So they say we're not going to bow. They don't bow. Everybody else is bowing. This is conspicuous when you're the only 3 people not bowing in the whole empire. They don't bow. They get ratted out and brought before the king, and then this happens. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought to the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you don't serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music." I love how it lists it every time. It's like he was very impressed with his band, you know? If you are ready to fall down and worship the image I've made, very good. But if you don't worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then, I love this line, oh man, talk about foreshadowing. Then, what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? The arrogance of empire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves to you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, then the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve the gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Man, as the great theologian John Reed said, this is punk rock. I mean, come on, this response is so good, and it teaches us so much about faith, doesn't it? It illustrates everything we've been talking about. Notice how they start. Our God is able to deliver us from your hand. We've read the stories, we know the stories, we know what he has done in the past, and we know he can do it again. So he can. Their faith is rooted in experiential knowledge based on what God has done. And because we've had that experiential knowledge, we feel confident in the present that he will save us. Confidence based on experience. He will. And here's the key though. But even if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow. Because ultimately, faith means trust in him. Okay? In him, not in what he can do, not in what he has done, not in what he will do, but in him. Faith is never, ever just about an outcome. It's about a person. Our faith is rooted in a person, in the character of God, not in an outcome. It's like Job famously said in his story, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Even if he doesn't deliver me, I still know he's good. And I know the choices he's making are right. They're standing here saying, we know he can save us. We think he probably will. Feeling pretty confident about that. But even if he doesn't, we're going to trust that he's good. He's with us. And you guys have to understand that the moment they said these words, the moment these words came out of their mouth, they had already won. At this point, there is nothing Nebuchadnezzar could do to him. If he throws them into the fire and they come out alive, awesome. What a story. If he throws them into the fire and they burn, they go to God. And he receives them into his presence as heroes. Guys, that's what this Christian life is. It's what would you do? How would you live if you knew you couldn't lose? That's where they were at. They were already in this moment fireproof. There was nothing he could do to him. You know, I think of that line from Star Wars. I know I have some Star Wars fans in the house today where Obi-Wan is fighting Darth Vader and he says, strike me down and I'll become more powerful than ever. That's what they're saying here. Go ahead, King, burn us up. Burn us up. He'll deliver us or he won't. Either way, we win. So, the question I want to ask today, quickly, is this. How did they do it? Because I want to just look at the story and say, that's so cool. But that's not the purpose of this series. The purpose of this series is, how do we get faith like those guys? These were just guys. They were just human beings. So how do we do it? Because the reality is, you don't just suddenly have that kind of faith, you know? We do not show up at the fiery furnace ready to respond with this kind of defiant faith if we haven't first cultivated that response in our daily lives. The reality is these guys lived lives of defiant faith, which, remember, wasn't against a person, it was toward God. You know, if we read in Daniel chapter 1, we don't have time to read the story, but they were offered all this really good food from Babylon, and they refused to eat it because it wasn't kosher. It was against the dietary laws that God had given them. They refused to eat it, and nevertheless, they got stronger. They got buffer through this whole experience, which isn't how protein synthesis works. They experienced a real-life miracle because they defied the economy of empire. In empire, we consume and we get stronger. For them, they relied, they depended, and they got stronger. Because they knew, as the Old Testament told them, as the Torah told them, that we don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. They experienced real-life miracle. They got stronger when they didn't eat. Crazy. They defied the economy of empire. We also see that they must have been rooted in the story of God. They must have known their Bibles well in order to defy the economy of empire. They had to defy the story of empire. There's a story out there. There's a way of being that makes sense in this world. And if you just kind of go with the flow, that's the story you'll tell yourself. It's a story of accumulating and gathering wealth and influence and power. It's a story about me and my kingdoms. But they were rooted in a different story. They must have known their Bibles inside and out to know that God could deliver them. They must have known the story and defied the story of empire on a regular basis. They must have been people of prayer, don't you think? So they defied the noise of empire so that they could hear the still small voice of God in the quiet, calling them to faithfulness. And to do this, they must have defied the individualism of empire that says it's all about just me. It's isolating. It's lonely. They must have been people of community. I love in this story how they respond in one voice. The Bible says Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king. And you get this picture of the three of them like almost speaking in unison, which probably didn't happen. But the idea is there. They were together. They were united. It wasn't one person making a choice for the three of them. They were in community, and that's the only way that this works. You guys, this gathering we're doing here, it matters a lot. It's not just a nice thing to do on a Sunday morning. It's not just a place to come and see friends. It's a place where you are reminded who you are so that your faith can be fortified and strengthened, so it can grow, so that when you go back out there, you'll have it. You know, I think, man, these three guys lived together, and that must have been so helpful for them. Because I imagine, you know, Shadrach coming home after a tough day at the office. And he walks in and he's just feeling downtrodden and he's frustrated and he's angry, and the pace of empire is starting to get to him, and he walks through the door and he's just talking about his day, and he's not sounding like himself, and suddenly Meshach slams his fist down on the table and says, Hananiah, remember who you are. Remember who God is. He's good. He's faithful. He's with you. We need that, you guys. We need this if we're going to survive an empire. They had to have defied the individualism of empire and really embraced the community. And to do all of this in a toxic environment, they must have just defied themselves. You know, every single day, a discipline of self-denial, a discipline of self-control that enabled them to thrive. They practiced this defiant faith, defying even what they might have felt like in a moment. You know, I think of David in the Psalms. When often in the Psalms it says things like, why so downcast, O my soul? You guys familiar with that phrase? Why so downcast, O my soul? That's David saying, come on, get up, my soul. Get up, self. Like, get back in the game. Why so downcast? Put your hope in God. Come on. We have to do that. We have to defy ourselves often. We have to defy our desires that are at war with what the Spirit is doing. We have to defy our exhaustion. We have to defy our apathy, our arrogance. We have to defy our individualism. We have to defy a lot of things about ourselves to follow Jesus in faithfulness to Him. And when we do, when we choose Him over all else, we are fireproof. I love what happens, and I'm going to wrap up with this. I know I'm going long. Again, second service will benefit from me trimming this down. Here's how it ends. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. His attitude toward them changed, and he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in the army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the fire. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into a blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked, weren't there 3 men tied up and thrown in the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. He said, look, I see 4 walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. And Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So they came out of the fire, and all these advisors that he lists in detail, again, very impressed with his entourage, they saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes weren't scorched, and there wasn't even a smell of fire on them. Crazy, crazy story. Nebuchadnezzar saw 2 things in the fire. First thing he saw was they were walking around. Now notice, he threw the men bound, which seems like a little bit of overkill to me, but nevertheless, he threw the men with ropes, and the ropes burned, but they didn't. The ropes burned, but they didn't, because they had cultivated this habit of faithfulness in the person of God. The only thing the fire could do was set them free. You guys, if you choose Him, if you're faithful to Him, the only thing the fire of life can do to you is make you stronger than before. It'll set you free. The second thing he saw, though, is even better. Because ultimately, like we talked about last week with Abraham, this isn't a story about 3 heroes, although they're awesome, and I can't wait to meet them. But it's about a God who enters the fire with His people. if you think about it, he could have really saved them in a whole bunch of different ways, you know? He could have just made them independently fireproof. He could have put out the flames on the spot. He could have turned the fire on the Babylonians. He could have just changed Nebuchadnezzar's mind. But instead, he allows them to go into the fire and then enters in with them because that's the kind of God he is. He does not stay distant from his people when they're suffering. He enters the flames with us. He is not aloof. He is not indifferent. He is a God who empathizes with us in our suffering, who comes near to us and saves us through proximity, through presence. And this whole story ends with this confession of faith where Nebuchadnezzar essentially says, let nobody, he says, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Don't let anybody talk bad about this guy. There's no other God, because he says, look at this, I love this. They trusted him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except theirs, their own God. Look at where it says at the very end here. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm accelerating here, but it says, for no other God can save in this way. This is the emperor of Babylon saying this. Because God allowed his people to go into the fire, did not spare them from the fire, and then entered in himself, all Babylon saw his glory. Sometimes God allows his people to walk into the fire. Doesn't spare us from it, but he doesn't leave us alone in it. And as we become people of presence in the suffering of life, the world watches and says, wait a minute, these people are experiencing suffering differently than I am. What do they know that I don't know? No other God is like this. None of the idols of empire are like this. I want to know what they know. And that's ultimately what this story's about. It's about a God who enters the fire with his people. Great story. Appreciate you all for sticking with me through it. We will be talking about more faithful stuff next week. John's going to be wrapping up the series with week 4. Excited to have you come back. Bring John up to close this, I think, right? Oh, I'm going to pray and then we'll close it. Okay. Whoo! Here we go. Lord, thanks so much. Thanks so much for this community. Thanks for their kindness and their welcome. But God, thanks so much for being who you are. Thanks for being with us in the fire. God who saves us from nearness. We love you and we thank you so much that you're always with us. You are so faithful to us. Teach us, Lord, daily to be faithful to you in the small choices of life so that when we come to the place where it really matters, we're ready. We love you. Amen.